This is from a short film I had actually done with Zbek. So you don't see Zbek in this shot, but he's sitting beside the young talent here. And just to give you an overview of why I came up with the LUTs, I was actually looking up makeup. And I'm not a huge makeup person at all. So this was like a first for me. And then I was literally in this minefield of like a Twilight Zone kind of a thing. And I was on one of the websites, and you have to go through this whole process of choosing different shades, you know, for your particular skin tone. And I kept thinking, you know, what if this was in color grading? Because I mean, I love to color grade, and this is just something I even do as a hobby. It didn't start out as something for work. And so I was saying, you know, well, what if we had, you know, different LUTs which could work for different shades of skin tones? And that's how this got started. And when I was thinking about it and how I think about Black skin in particular, it's a couple of shades. It's like a matte brown, a yellow brown, a red brown, and then a black blue. So that varies, yes, depending on the environments that, you know, each person is in. But that is how, and one of the reasons why I decided to do this. And then also when I had released it, it was in February, Black History Month. And I thought, you know, it was a good opportunity to do it, but also just to make it accessible for people who wanted to color grade or were starting out color grading, and they, you know, they needed to do a quick slap on of a LUT. Obviously, not to just slap on and leave it alone, but also to tweak it. So these are literally the end results, but I'm just going to go through maybe from start to finish, and it's very, very quick. And as you can see, the nodes here, it's very, very simple. So I'll just go into this. Actually, let me just take them all off. I'll just delete all of this. And I'll reset this. So this is the original image. And so this is the raw coming out of the camera. And the first thing that I tell people when they download my LUT is, well, first of all, it's made for Blackmagic cameras. So that's one specific. The other thing is it's made for the color science of the Gen 4 Blackmagic. So another one of the things, you know, people need to pay attention to is not just, you know, what lens you use, what filters you use, but the color science behind each particular camera. So for example, I find that the Canon color science is the more natural, as real to life tones as you can get. It's the easiest to color grade. Blackmagic may not be the easiest to color grade, but you can get some really good skin tones from it once you delve into it deeper. And then as it relates to Sony, so Sony, I am less likely inclined to use Sony cameras, and only because you get a lot of magenta in the skin tones. And so what I have to do normally when I'm shooting, because I light for the grade, is I have to dial down the magenta. But as you can see here in this slot at the bottom here, even in Blackmagic cameras, what I find in Blackmagic cameras is the raw it shifts a little bit more to the green. And if you look over here, you can actually see a bit of it in the scopes, where the mid-tones going to the highlights are a bit green. And so normally in camera, between 10 and 22, I just dial up the tint. So it goes a little bit more red, or it evens out, I should say, it evens out the green. So the first thing is just creating your settings here, going to clip, selecting Gen 4. This was actually shot, I believe, on my Ursa Mini Pro. So this was automatically Gen 4. And I'll show you some other clips that vary in terms of the color science. And then, yeah, just selecting highlight recovery, making this custom. I like to make this custom. So even though I had it originally at 56, I want the leverage and leeway of being able to change the color temperature. So I'm just going to create a node over here. I like leaving the first node bland and basic without any additions to it. So I'm just going to create this other node. And the first step for me outside of setting the color science is white balance in the image. One thing I should mention, and this is something that not many people pay attention to, is gamma. The color science that not just the color science, but the output of what you are color grading for, that's very important. And that has a lot to do with the output environment that you're grading for. So I tend to set, and I'm going to go to project settings. I tend to stick to and color management gamma 2.4. And there's a whole history behind that. The long and short though is gamma 2.2 tends to be good for like office lighting and watching on a computer screen, while gamma 2.4 tends to be more broadcast, prime time, like you're watching in the evening, not totally dark, but in a not so bright setting. And in other words, that means that the contrasts are a bit darker. It's a little bit more obvious as opposed to if you're using gamma 2.2. That said, you have to pay attention to when and how you're color grading in terms of the environment that you're color grading in. So, and it should match the output environment that you're color grading for, because what you're seeing while you're color grading is going to be affecting how it actually looks in the output. So just ensure, at least for me, for these, the best output for my particular LUTs is gamma 2.4. And I think BBC set that as a standard for broadcast for them. And it's also, I think gamma 2.4 is what LED screens are easier acclimatized to as opposed to gamma 2.2 or 2.3. All right, so back to this white balancing, I'll just pull up this right here. So so in terms of white balancing, as you can see, the midtones, you see the white here, but there's a little bit of red in the highlights. But before I get to that, I like to just add some contrast and highlights, and I tend to like to keep it above 128, but below 768. So I'm just going to drag it down a bit here. And if you look at the graph as well, you'll see that this reflects the image. So the main part of the image, which is really right here, which is below 768, is what I'm paying attention to. Over here is really showing you the highlights that's happening over here. So I'm not looking at that as a gauge, but I'm more looking at the main part of the image as my gauge. So yes, I have increased the shadows, but I like to just do a little S curve. So I'll just bump it up just a little bit. So you'll see that it's in this relative ballpark right here. And then I'm looking at the red. So I'm just going to go to my primary color wheel. And I like going to this slot. So yes, I like using the wheels, but I find that this is more accurate when you can actually change the numbering and the meters. And so I'm just going to drag down the highlights a bit in the reds, as you can see. I'm just going to put it to about 0.98. Even if it looks slightly, even if I think there's still a little bit more red than I'd like in it, I tend not to go too low. I'd like to keep it in a mid-ground. So instead of going to 0.97, I'll just keep that 0.98 because the LUT will also affect it. So then I'm just going to add another node, and this is where I'm going to put the LUT on. And I'm just going to right click, add the LUT. And so here I have my LUTs. This one is actually not out, which is the caramel LUT. But I'm going to try dark pecan. And I have two versions of dark pecan. One is more yellow brown and one is more red brown. So I'm just going to add dark pecan, and all of a sudden you'll see that image changes. You'll also see that your waveform changes as well, and everything is a little bit more contrasty. So because everything is a little bit more contrasted, there's one of two things that we can do. It's either we can diffuse the LUT, or we can adjust the S curve and our contrast and our highlights. So I tend to like to diffuse the LUT because the LUT also affects, it affects color. So I'm just going to go into this tab. I'm going to just take it down, probably put it to, I don't know, 0.8. Let's see how it looks. Let's see how that works. So it's a little bit lighter. I'm just going to go back. Let me just name this so this is very clear. Let's put dark LUT. So I'm going to go back to my white balance node. And I'm just going to raise the shadows just a little. And then I'm going to go back to the dark pecan. And another thing I like to adjust is saturation. And this also tends to depend on what setting your talent is in. So if it's outside by the beach, if you want it to be bright and cherry, then you can go a little bit more punchy. So I'm just going to just increase this by 10, and you can see the difference, and I'll just blow that up so you can see it there. But just looking at it, to me, if I look at the bottles in the background, I see a slight tinge of like it looks pink in the highlights. So I want to take that down a bit. But I also see it a bit over here in the sky as well, in the blue of the sky. It's a bit like slightly purple. So I'm just going to go back to this same tab here. And for my highlights where it says gain on the LUT node, I'll just take that down a bit. And you can see that it makes a slight difference. But you have to be careful because as you can see, as I'm going down, it makes the skin tones a little bit greener. So it's more of a balance. I'll probably put on 0.98. So yeah, so that's it that's one option for this image. And then you can also scroll through. You can look at, some of the other LUTs in the pack, and yes, the LUTs are free. So I'll go to dark pecan. And actually I like dark pecan too. So I may change it from the dark pecan that we had before was a little bit more red in the skin tones, and I'll just blow it up so you can see, well, this is more of a brown yellow. And because I know the talent and I was there in person with her, I feel like her skin in real life is closer to this than it is otherwise. When I just started color grading, I used to color grade to just try and make things look different. But now I've been color grading to make things look as realistic as possible. And I think it just depends on the project as well, because, there will be projects where you want it to look, even more exaggerated in this way than in another. But for this particular project, we just wanted it to be pretty simple and as close as possible to the subject. So I'm just going to move to this other one and delete all of this and reset. So going back to the start, we already have our settings set to gamma 2.4. I'm just going to, if we look down here, so this was actually shot on the Blackmagic cinema camera, which is Gen 1. So this is what the raw originally looked like. If I set it to Gen 4, you will see that the colors are much different. So all of this is to say that even if these LUTs are set to Gen 4, you can still use it for footage from other Blackmagic cameras with other color sciences. You just have to adjust as you go along. Because what I can clearly see from this is that if I color grade on Gen 1, then I will have a less saturated image with less red. If I color grade on Gen 4, I'm just going to have to compensate for that red. So just moving on, adding that node, and I'm just going to white balance. Oops. And once again, pulling up my scopes and making that slight S curve to go a little bit between 128 and 768, just to keep it within a good range. It isn't too blown out. And then I'm also just doing it by eye as well. I'm using the scopes as, yes, a guide, but it's also good to, trust your gut and go by eye. I'm going to turn this, sorry, I think this was originally at 5600, so I'm going to put it back at 5600, and we are still at Gen 4. So I'll show you the difference between Gen 4 and Gen 1. Going back to my LUTs, let's try dark syrup. As you can see, dark syrup is more of a red-blue tone LUT. For me, this is way too much in terms of intensity, in terms of saturation, but just to show you the difference between grading Gen 1 and Gen 4, this is currently Gen 4, so we already know it's going to add more red and it's going to be more saturated. So let's try doing it in Gen 1. And automatically you see Gen 1, less saturated. Actually, the skin tones are a little bit more blue in the shadows. Gen 4, the mid-tones, the skin tone is definitely very red. That said, we're not going to just leave it by itself. I'll just still work with Gen 4. So going back to saturation, instead of increasing saturation, I want to take out saturation. So I'm just going to go down to 40. And that for me already starts looking good. The only other thing I would possibly do, and let me just label this one second. Dark syrup. And this is something else that when people ask me about color grading, it's something that, you know, people need to pay attention to. When you go into the color bar section, or even just, you know, the primary wheels, remember that you have the log wheels as well, because the color of these shadows is important. This is a tux too blue in the shadows for me, so I'm just going to drag it up in the opposite direction. So it's a tad bit yellow, but what happens is not only does it affect the shadows, but I think it also, for me, I can see it affects the midtones as well. So this, for me, looks better than what was before, and this is actually closer to the talent skin tone in reality, but just a little bit more heightened for camera. And just to show you the difference, I'm going to just hit option D. So this is Gen 4, what it looked like before in Gen 4, raw, without any color grading. And this is what it looks like after with color grading. If I go back to Gen 1, which is what it was originally shot as, that's how it looks. And then this is how it looks with color grading. Obviously, if this is the setting that I want Gen 1, I would bump up the saturation so that it looks more like this. Whether it's 60% or whether it's at 50, I like 50. So this would probably be my final image. But as you can see, the difference between the skin tones here, this is more of a desaturated brown going to blues. It's still a bit red, but going to blues. This is more of a yellow brown. So one of the important things to consider when, yes, color grading Black people is it's not just one shade of brown. And also depending on the environment, that can also change. And then here's another. And so I'm just going to try another look. Just delete all of this and reset. And put this back to 56, which I think was the original. So this was Gen 4. This was shot on the Blackmagic Pocket camera. So now we've gone through 3 different types. So this was originally Gen 4. And once again, I'm just going to add the node. Very simple. White balance this. And white balancing doesn't have to take too much time. Once it's, well, I'm assuming on the day that you're shooting, you try and white balance as well. So it takes a lot of time off the colorist back for them to have to go and tweak too much. So yes, I'm going to try and drag down the shadows slightly above 128, highlights slightly below 768. All right, already I'm seeing that it's looking a bit dull, so I feel as if I'm going to have to add some saturation when I add the LUT. So putting on the LUT, let's try tawny. So for me, caramel and tawny are opposites of each other. So caramel is more of a yellow red, and tawny is more of a, it's a dull brown, but it looks more, slightly more green, or it balances out the red in caramel. It just depends on the person's skin tone. So that's when the LUT is slapped on. So what I'm going to do now is adjust the opacity of the LUT. So instead of having it at the intensity, at full intensity, I'm just going to turn it down to 0.7, see how that looks. That works a little bit more, but I still feel as if looking on the scopes that we could bump up the shadows a bit. But before I do that, because I don't like how desaturated it is, I'm going to bump up the saturation. Maybe put it to 70. Oops. Right. So already I'm seeing that it's looking a little bit too red for my liking. So I'm just going to go back to, the white balance first and adjust the shadows, so bringing them up a bit so I can see the subject better. The other thing I'm noticing is that once again, the shadows, and there's nothing wrong with blue shadows. It's just for the particular story that I know we were telling for this project. They wanted it to be a little bit more brighter and not so dull. And so I know I can also change my color temperature because yes, it was shot in RAW. So I'm just going to bump that up to 6,000. So it's a little bit less blue, and already it starts looking much better, and I'll blow that up. And if I want to take out some of the red in the midtones, I'm going to go back to the LUT and I'll just label this. And I'll go back to my color wheels. And I mean, there are other There are a lot more features in DaVinci, but this is really just a basic overview. I'll go back to my gamma and I'll take down the red just a bit. If I go too far, as you can see, it'll start getting green, and it not just affects it, it affects the entire image if I don't have the skin tone selected in particular, which is another thing that you can do. So let's just undo that. Oops. And I'm going to create another node. So the LUT is on everything right now, but let's say I want to focus particularly on his skin tones. So I'm just going to create this other node, and I'm just going to label it skin. And then I'm going to go down to my picker. And with this selected, I'm going to click on the image. And so right now that is what is selected. And all I did was hit Shift H. So Shift H gets you in and out. Now, as you can see, it's very spotty. It's not so smooth, but it gets where you want to highlight. So I'm just going to improve that a bit. And how I can do that is by going down to the bottom of the page here. And I'm just going to extend the denoise. And if you look, things get smooth. I'll blow that up so you can see. So it's a little bit less grainy and spotty. And then also you can adjust these settings of clean black and clean white. Clean black takes it away from the hairline. So I'm just going to decrease that, leave that, and maybe increase the white. Okay, and if you want to add more selections to it, it just depends. Then you just go to the addition right here. So if anybody's familiar with Photoshop, or if you're a graphic designer, I had a background in graphic design, then you can just add to the selection. But you notice as you add to the selection, you have to adjust the other ones as you go along, because then you may select something that you don't want. Let me take this down a lot. All right, so let's say we're working with this selection, and I'll just come out of it, coming out of it, hitting Shift H. And I'll just show you like a huge difference. Not that this is what it's going to look like, but let's bump this 50 up to 90. You'll see exactly where we're working within the workspace we're working with. So right now, this is at 50. So if I want to increase the saturation on this, and only the skin alone, it's not affecting the rest of the image, then I can probably go up to 60 if I want to. That is a little bit too much for me. Let me try 55. 55 kind of works. And then if I want to take the red out, so it depends on where I want the red out. If I want to take it out from the midtones, then I would adjust the gamma and take that down. So it doesn't affect anything else but within the image. And if I hit Command D on the skin node, you can see the before and after. It's very subtle, but I can see it. And let me bump up the saturation so you can. 57. And also another key feature for me in Resolve, one of my favorites is actually offset. Offset, I tend to like to use the color wheel because I guess I see it better, meaning in terms of the changes all happening at once. And I'll just move it around so you can see exactly what we're working with. So we're just moving around, but what the color wheel allows me to do is just have the options of going really quickly, cycling through really quickly, you know, different options, different combinations of red, greens, and blues to see which shade I like the best without having to adjust one section, then the other, then the other. So that's why I like the offset color wheel instead of using the offset bars. And then just showing you the difference. I'm blowing that out. So you can select the skin tones alone. The important thing is when using LUTs, don't just slap the LUT on. Adjust the LUT, adjust your other settings, ensure that the image is white balanced, ensure that you have the correct color science selected, and ensure that you are color grading for the right output, and ensure that you know what that output is. And that can be affected by whether you're color grading for broadcast. And normally what we would do is we would have a color grade for each. So if we know that the output is going to be for the internet, then we color grade for the internet and set the tones for that. If we know our color grading for broadcast, then we have a different output, and so on and so forth. And just for Zbek's benefit, I'll just show you a clip of, it's very, very short. This is a scene where he's the father of this young boy who's dreaming of flying to the moon. And this is the pose Zbek. He just pulls this out of his hat in a second. But it was a very touching moment. And then for color purposes, that's the before and that's the after.
Thank you, Gabrielle. That was so fantastic. I am super enthusiastic about all the details you shared and the in-depth work that you do. Are you self-taught with all of this?
So I am self-taught as it relates to color grading. What actually happened was I did my first degree in media and communication here in Jamaica. And I specialized in multimedia, so I did a lot of graphic design. And that's where my love for, color and light and just editing even started, and imagery. And then I had always wanted to do film, but we didn't have a film school here, so I did my master's in New Zealand. And it was when I was doing my thesis film, I had to go back to New Zealand to edit it. And I knew how to edit because I'd learned that here. And I knew, audio editing, video editing. But then it came to color grading and I was on a scholarship. And so I couldn't hire a colorist. I didn't have the funds to hire a colorist. And so that forced me to then look into color grading. I think at the time, because this was 2010, there was an Apple software called Color. And so I literally started from there. This was before DaVinci Resolve. This was even before, Premiere or Final Cut, came out with their options. And so that's how that got started. And because I was then forced to do my own short film, that's where I developed a love for it. But I think what made me even more impassioned about color grading was just being dissatisfied a lot of the time when, I'd shoot something and then I know what I would shoot, but then I'd see the result. Or it's just, whether it's, I don't know, laziness or whatever it is, when somebody just slaps the same grade on every frame without adjusting tones or shades, it was a bit frustrating. And so I just decided to learn it myself and try it out myself. And it's been quite a few years. I would say officially probably about 6 or 7 years that I've been doing it.
Excellent. You're very, very good at it. And I so appreciate all the detail that you shared with us and the detail that you go into between this image, which is absolutely gorgeous, and the various things that you can do, and how you also talked about, and this is something that we've talked about with other participants of the Talk on Tone series, is the skin undertones. Whatever the flesh tone is, there are undertones in every skin. And when I light various skin tones, whether it's in documentary or narrative, I'm acutely aware of the undertones and how the light sources, whether it's daylight or ambient light, my lighting tools reflecting all the Kelvins, all of the color temperature from those sources, affecting the reflective image of the skin tone and the undertone in the skin tone. And then if there's makeup on, what the pigmentation in the makeup is reflecting back.
Exactly.
And I'm so happy that you spoke to all of that, because that is critical to really truly represent the likeness of someone on screen.
It does. And one of the other things that I think not many people look at is, even as you mentioned, pigmentation, even with age and aging and color grading people of different ages, that's a whole other science and a whole other area that people don't pay attention to, because pigmentation changes over the years, melanin changes over the years. So I think it's very important for me, and specifically as it relates to my LUTs, but just in general, I think it's very important to represent people as they are, or how they would also like to be seen and as they see themselves. Because what I've found, especially because I've worked on quite a few productions internationally that have come here to Jamaica, is, we'll shoot something, but based on my perception of how my people look versus their perception of how my people look, it's night and day. And so what you'll find is that there's a stereotype as it relates to the Caribbean, where Caribbean people, they will just literally probably slap on an orange and kind of like an orangey tinged look, because it represents heat and humidity and maybe a little bit of excitement and, you know, summer flavor, whatever it is. But that's not how we look all the time, every time. So I think, you know, there are various stereotypes, and it's not just Caribbean cultures, but other cultures. And I think that's something that we have to pay attention to.
And all skin tones tan. You know, I think
exactly.
You know, everybody tans, and the melanin changes color depending on the season. And that's something that I don't think there's enough conversation on as well. Yeah, it's really important to understand that. So, and especially too, when you were the boy sitting in front of the sail, all of your images are amazing. I'm so excited to hear from you on all of them. But when you went into the grain structure of when you isolated and popped out just the skin tone and you worked on that, do you mind bringing that one up again?
Sure.
Yes, and so if we could go back to that, that's fantastic that you're getting that specific, because this is a lot of, you're exactly right, a lot of people just pop a LUT on, maybe do a few exposure adjustments or saturation adjustments within the LUT that's already constructed, but that doesn't, you know, truly address the actual likeness of the person.
It does not. And not only does it not do that, it then puts, you know, when you get to select somatic skin tone and focus on that solely, then you don't affect the rest of the image. And I mean, there are other things, you know, to consider, like, you know, mood, tone, what's happening in the scene emotionally, even. And just even going back to this shot with this young talent, this scene was a very emotional scene, but it wasn't like a bright, happy-go-lucky, you know, scene or an environment. So, you know, those are some of the things that, you know, we should consider.
Exactly. And you're, you know, with this image too, when you were addressing the grain structure, this is something that I feel a lot more awareness could be talked about and educated on when it comes to digital cinematography, because what many newer cinematographers may not be totally aware of, when you pop a lens on, you know, any airy body, for example, or a black magic body, pretty much any professional digital body these days, if you pop a nice, you know, big open aperture, shallow focus look on things, almost anything looks beautiful.
It looks, and pristine.
It's hard to take a bad picture, right? But there's so much more detail in this, right? And so what happens is those darker, as the skin tones get darker and shadows become more intricate in those details, grain noise actually happens inside the digital process, inside the sensor, inside the pixels. And when it gets to the colorist stage, so you could be off filming whatever you want and think it's looking beautiful on the monitors, and you get to the color grade, and in the shadows, in the blacks, there are noise, there are showings of noise, there are showings of more grain structure. And I talked to one of the other talks we did with a colorist, and Andrea Zbek, who's in Los Angeles, who's a Canadian actually. She's amazing at color grading too. And she talked about instances where clients would say, well, why are the blacks not noisy?
Exactly.
And they would say, why is this woman's face, who was a black woman in the shot, why is her face noisy? And it was like, well, there's noise in all the blacks in the image, but you're happening to see it more on her cheek because of the way it was shot. So it really...
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think that, you know, being able to think about lighting for the grade is so important for that reason. Because, for example, for that situation, just setting her off against the background, or maybe lighting that shadow, or how you expose, because what I tend to do is I slightly overexposed to the right so that I can get the detail in the shadows. And then just even understanding the camera and understanding, you know, how you can get, or how much information you can get from the shadows and the highlights is something that's very, very important. So understanding, yes, the equipment that you're using. And even as you talk about, you know, noise patterns, and there's also fixed noise patterns as well. I'm thinking of even filters, and we're talking about textures and skin tones, whether it's ND filters, which have color casts, depending on which brand you use, or diffusion filters, which may smooth out, the pigmentation that you have in the skin. But how you light, the filters you use, yes, what lens you use, but the cameras and their color science and their dynamic range, all of that is supremely important in terms of the end product and how that comes about.
Excellent. And so when we can talk more about your process once we finish the screen share, but while we're in the screen share, with maybe the image of the second image with the boy in the shadow. So you worked on this. I'll start. I'm thinking of an edit point in my head. Can you talk about this? This is fantastic, and the work that you shared with us on this was really amazing, because you went into the undertones as well of the skin tone on this, and also the shadows. Can you talk about the shadows in this to maintain the detail without hitting too much noise structure?
So one of the reasons why I outline when using MyLuts is to try and stick between, for example, in the scopes. This is actually maybe a little bit slightly under than what I would normally want it to be. Is when I know it's exported and rendered out, anything that goes below 128, I may lose, and it may start getting noisy, it may start getting grainy. So that's one thing I'd pay attention to. In the actual shoot, on the actual shoot day, what was important to me visually was something that was a bit monochromatic outside of the white that they're both wearing. So I knew that the browns are going to be close to the blacks, but and this may seem very unimportant now, but if you look carefully, this shot, his head is against a slightly lighter background. So he's set off against it. But yes, definitely once color graded, I try to stick to above 128, because anything that's below that, you tend to either lose that information or it starts getting grainy and it just looks horrible. But the most important thing is to light for the grade so that you don't have to bring it up, and then it affects other things within the image as well.
Do you mind showing us the raw of this image?
So this was the raw. Let me just make sure this was the right. This was the raw of the image. So when I was mentioning that I slightly overexposed to the right a bit, if you look on the scopes, it looks properly exposed, but I have to ensure that for my shadows, I can see the detail in that in camera, so that I know when I pull it into post, they won't have, an issue, whomever edits it, whomever color grades it. So this is it without any, color grading or anything at all, any adjustments. So yes, I do expose, yes, center, but what I have found specifically as it relates to Blackmagic cameras is once I expose slightly above 128, but below 768. And in camera, in the waveforms, it's above 20 and below 80. Then I should be good.
Excellent. And then you can flip back to a LUT again, just so we can see. Fantastic. And let's just talk about the undertones again for a moment. You changed LUTs a couple of times on some of the images. Maybe use this one again and bump a LUT and just talk about there are blue blacks and red blacks, and exactly. That's another part of the conversation that some makeup artists that aren't darker skin tones themselves miss, especially with pigmentation and makeup. I know a lot of actors that actually do their own makeup because they know, they just know what works for them on camera and what doesn't,
So that is very important because, and this kind of goes back to, when I'm thinking about it, it goes back to probably even high school days for me. And, just taking that graduation photo, and I recall, especially in high school, I had a very close friend, and there was another person in my class, and they were of really dark skin. And every time they would have their photos taken for the yearbook, you would not see their faces because everything would just be literally black except the white of their eyeballs. And they were mercilessly teased for it. And I just thought it was a bit, unconscionable that you don't either adjust your lighting or adjust your grading so that you make people visible and the way that they, are seen in real life. But what that reminded me of was, yes, the blue undertones in skin tones, but then trying to properly represent that. So I'm not going to make them look blue black, but it's just a subtleness in the blue. And for example, let's say I go back and I'm just going to adjust. So I brought up the blues a little bit, so it's now more into the yellows, but you can still see the slight blue in the blacks. I can see it from where I am, and I'll just pull that up so you can see. Even in the reds aren't exactly orange red. It's more of like a, I don't know if you call this a mauve or a, those strange colors. But if I pull it back down to the blues a bit in the shadows, it's very subtle. It just gets a little bit more blue, and that could also work if you want it that way. But yes, Black people's skin tone is not just one shade of brown. It's not just stark black. And it's really important that how we see them in everyday life is represented on screen. And, it brings us to another point. These are actors and talent, and you don't want to detract from the performance that they're putting on screen. And also they do use these examples for their work and for whenever they're auditioning, and you want people to take them seriously. So as much as we're looking at it from the color grading perspective and that alone, I just think one thing affects the other, which affects the other. And especially when it's in close-ups, you want to get the details right in skin tones so they're properly represented. The story emotionally, mood-wise is properly represented, so that you have a good film, a good product, a good video, whatever the output is.
It's so true. Everything is connected. And that's one thing we try and talk about here. We talk on tones. What's your approach to tell a story?
So the first thing starts with the vision of the director for me, if I'm not directing. And I do ask them, what's the mood and tone that you're going for? That's the first thing. And then also visually, how do you want the person to appear? Do you want them to appear, do you want their skin to be soft? Do you want it to be realistic, almost like a documentary type, cinema verite, real life kind of vibe? Or, do you want me to put on a filter, which will affect, yes, the pigmentation and the detail? Or do you want to get the detail? So these are some of the questions that I ask, which then also affects lighting. One, where the lights are, what color the lights are, what types of lights, then what level of diffusion. And sometimes I'll double diffuse. If the person is too dark, though, it means that I'm just going to have to pump up on the intensity of the light, which will then affect, which light source I actually use. So generally speaking, though, and this is just, very basic, when we're shooting outdoors, there is always some sort of silk or diffusion overhead, whether the person is Black or white. But obviously, if the person is of lighter skin or a lighter skin shade, then we have to double diffuse. But then also that affects, how soft they look on screen. And so for commercial purposes, mostly, I tend to double diffuse quite a bit. But yes, like I said, every action has a reaction, or I have to change something, whether it is a light source to bump that up, or, whether it is makeup even to help out. And then also there's a choice between, whether I use tungsten versus whether, I go daylight. And I found that tungsten lights, and I know this has probably been said, but I do find, and maybe it's my concept of even just yellow brown, I find that tungsten works really well with dark skin. I also do like, however, if I'm shooting something that's gloomy and it's somebody who is really dark, I also like using daylight, or even just making it even a little bit more blue. So, I've also played with that as well. The danger only of doing that is when we're going back to talking about, grain and going down into the shadows and how that's presented. And so sometimes I'll leave a bit of that to the color grading, which is, the undershadows and the log that you can bring up in post. But yeah, all of those things are really relevant